Memphis, 1975. A suffocating summer night. The highway stretches out like an endless strip of black glass, broken only by the flicker of neon gas station signs and the occasional hum of passing trucks. Inside a sleek black Stutz Blackhawk, Elvis Presley grips the wheel tighter than he should. His fingers tap nervously against the leather, in rhythm with a blues guitar bleeding from the radio. He isn't just speeding, he's fleeing. Not from the crowd, not from the cameras, but from a silence inside himself that grows louder with every mile. 90 miles an hour, headlights carving the darkness, the king looks less like an untouchable icon and more like a man trying to outrun his own reflection. Then, suddenly, the night splits. Blue lights flare in the rearview mirror. A siren wails through the emptiness, slicing the road in two. A patrol car closes in. The young officer behind the wheel doesn't yet know who he's stopping. To him, it's just another reckless driver in a shiny car. But when Elvis pulls to the shoulder and the badge of authority meets the weight of legend, the quiet back road of Tennessee becomes the stage for a collision no one could have scripted. The question hangs in the air, pulsing like the siren itself. What happens when the king of rock and roll is forced to answer, not to his fans, but to the law? Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The highway stretched out like a ribbon of black silk, cutting through the Tennessee night. For miles, there was nothing but the hum of tires against asphalt, the faint shimmer of distant headlights, and the restless rhythm of cicadas somewhere beyond the ditches. The stillness had a weight to it, like the air before a storm, broken only by the low growl of a Stutz Blackhawk gliding far above the speed limit. Inside the car, Elvis Presley leaned into the wheel. Dark sunglasses concealed his tired eyes, even though it was past midnight. He wasn't racing toward anywhere in particular. He simply wanted to feel the road, the rush of wind, the illusion of being just another man on an open stretch of highway. Fame didn't exist here, at least for as long as he could outrun it. Then came the sound. A piercing wail ripped through the quiet like a blade, red and blue lights flaring against the rearview mirror, siren bouncing off the emptiness of the night. The moment collapsed in on itself. The king of rock and roll, a man who had filled stadiums, suddenly became nothing more than another driver caught speeding. Elvis slowed, guiding the Blackhawk onto the gravel shoulder. Dust rose in the glow of the patrol car's headlights. The crunch of tires followed, deliberate and unhurried. A young police officer stepped out, no more than mid-20s, his uniform crisp, his face set in a mask of stern professionalism. His flashlight cut across the windshield, pausing on the figure inside. "License and registration," the officer said, his voice steady, carrying more authority than years of service could yet justify. Elvis didn't argue. He reached calmly into the glove compartment, handed over the papers, then slid a leather wallet from his jacket and produced his driver's license. The sunglasses remained on. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the tick of the cooling engine. At first, the officer didn't look closely. Another wealthy man, he thought. Another local hotshot with too much money and too little restraint. He'd been warned about these types. Smug, untouchable, convinced they could buy their way past a citation. This one was no different, he told himself. Expensive car, polished demeanor, the arrogance of speed. But then his eyes fell on the name printed neatly across the license. Elvis Aaron Presley. For a heartbeat, he froze. The name was more than ink. It was a legend, a shadow stretching across radio waves, movie screens, and the hearts of millions. His pulse jumped, yet he forced his jaw to stay tight. He cleared his throat and adjusted his grip on the flashlight. Inside, his thoughts fought each other. It can't be. Not here. Not on my route. But the face, partially hidden behind dark lenses, was unmistakable in its outline. The famous jaw, the hair slicked even in the late hours of the night. The officer swallowed. His training screamed at him. Treat him like anyone else. But another voice whispered, "That's Elvis Presley. People would give a lifetime just to stand this close." He steadied himself, fingers pressing into the license as if grounding his resolve. "You know how fast you were going?" he asked finally. Elvis tilted his head slightly, lips twitching with the hint of a smile. "Faster than I should, I suppose." His voice was low, rich, unmistakable. There was no mistaking it now. The officer's chest tightened. He wanted to soften, to laugh, to shake the man's hand, but he couldn't. Not with the badge pinned to his chest. The uniform demanded something else: authority, impartiality. "Sir, the speed you were driving at isn't just a ticket offense," the officer said firmly, though he had to will his voice not to waver. "It's considered reckless. By procedure, I may have to take you in." The words shocked even him as he spoke them. Arrest Elvis Presley? The absurdity of it pressed against his ribs, yet the duty was clear. He couldn't back down, not if he wanted to look himself in the mirror tomorrow. Elvis leaned back in his seat, the smile fading into something more thoughtful. He didn't protest. He didn't throw his fame like a shield. Instead, there was almost a flicker of curiosity in his expression, as if he wanted to see how far the young officer would go. For once, he was anonymous. Not a king, not an idol, just a man pulled over on a dark road. The officer studied him again, the struggle clear in his eyes. He admired Elvis, had grown up with his music echoing from jukeboxes and car radios, but here was a moment that cut through admiration. Was he a fan, or was he an officer sworn to uphold the law? Both identities clawed at him, each pulling in a different direction. The silence grew heavy, pressing into the small space between them. Elvis broke it first. "You've got a job to do," he said softly, the weight of the words carrying more than compliance. It sounded almost like respect, an acknowledgement of the young man's struggle. The officer held his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something different. Not a star, not a headline, just a man. Flesh, bone, and vulnerability, sitting on the side of a lonely highway in the dead of night. His grip on the license tightened. His heart pounded louder than the fading echo of the siren. Duty, fame, respect, fear. They swirled in him like a storm. He wanted to turn away, to deny the moment. But it was here, pressing on him like the weight of history. And so, he steadied his voice once more, forcing himself to speak the words that would push this night into something unforgettable. "Step out of the vehicle, mister." Presley gravel crunched beneath polished boots as the officer waited for Elvis to step out. The air was cooler now, night winds brushing across the field grass, carrying the faint smell of damp soil. Elvis closed the heavy door of the Black Hawk behind him, movements unhurried, deliberate. The car stood like a silent witness under the flashing lights, its chrome glinting red and blue. The young policeman kept his shoulders square. Inside, his nerves twisted, but he refused to let them show. He wasn't some star-struck kid anymore. He was sworn to uphold the law. And right now, the man in front of him wasn't an idol. He was a driver, clocked well over the legal limit. "You understand," the officer said, his tone measured, "that the speed you were driving isn't a minor slip. It's enough to classify as reckless endangerment." Elvis raised an eyebrow, his face unreadable. "So, what does that mean for me, officer?" It means— The words caught in his throat for a second, but he forced them out, crisp and exact. It means I may need to place you under arrest. The silence that followed seemed to echo louder than the siren ever had. The king of rock and roll, who had played for presidents and filled stadiums, now stood on the side of an empty highway, facing the reality of handcuffs and a ride to the county jail. Elvis didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head, regarding the officer with a calm curiosity. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you plan to haul me into your station tonight. And tomorrow, every newspaper in America will print that Elvis Presley got locked up for speeding?" There was no mockery in his voice, no anger, only a strange, probing kind of amusement, as though he were testing the resolve of the man in front of him. The officer's jaw tightened. "I don't care what the papers print," he replied. "I care about the law." That answer landed heavier than the sound of the patrol car idling beside them. Elvis studied him, and for a fleeting moment, something stirred behind the sunglasses. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't insult. It was recognition. Because in that unwavering face, Elvis saw a reflection of himself. Not the legend, not the man worshipped by millions, but the boy from Tupelo who once had nothing but a cheap guitar and the belief that he could be more. He remembered the stares of adults who doubted him, the nights when the weight of rules and expectations pressed against his chest. He remembered the hunger to stand tall, to be someone who couldn't be swayed. Elvis breathed out slowly. The highway seemed to quiet around them. "You remind me," he said, voice lower now, almost confessional, "of a kid I used to be. Somebody who wanted to prove the world wrong, no matter how much pressure came down on him." The officer shifted, uneasy with the sudden intimacy of the moment. He gripped his belt, forcing himself not to soften. "I'm not here to prove anything, sir. I'm here to do my duty." Elvis let the words settle, then reached into his jacket pocket. For an instant, the officer stiffened, hand hovering near his holster, but Elvis only pulled out a worn leather wallet, thinner than one would expect from a man of his fortune. From it, he drew a small, gleaming badge, heavy in the palm of his hand. "Take a look," he said, extending it. The officer hesitated before leaning closer. It was unmistakable, an honorary lawman's badge, gifted years ago by a Southern sheriff who had admired Presley's patriotism. The symbol carried weight. It wasn't counterfeit. It was genuine. The officer's stomach knotted. Elvis Presley wasn't just a celebrity flaunting his fame. He had been officially recognized, honored as part of the Brotherhood of the Badge, even if symbolically. "You see," Elvis said quietly, almost as if reading his thoughts, "I've always respected what you men do. More than anyone can imagine." For a moment, the young man felt the ground shift beneath him. If he accepted the badge as proof, he could walk away, write it off as a misunderstanding, and no one would blame him. But if he did, would he betray the oath he had taken? His throat went dry. He forced his eyes off the badge and back onto the man holding it. "That doesn't change what happened tonight," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. A flicker of admiration crossed Elvis's features. He closed the wallet, sliding the badge back inside. He didn't argue. In fact, he almost looked relieved. "You've got grit," Elvis murmured. "The kind most people lose once the world starts leaning on them." The radio crackled from the officer's patrol car, a dispatcher's voice breaking the fragile stillness. Backup was on its way. Protocol demanded it. Soon, another set of headlights would pierce the night, and the situation would spiral into something bigger than either of them could contain. Elvis knew it. The officer knew it. Time was running thin. For an instant, The thought of escape flashed in Elvis's mind. He could be back in the Black Hawk, vanish down the back roads, leave the headlines to chase shadows. Money could cover the tracks. Lawyers could bury the incident. But another part of him, the part that had stared poverty in the face as a child and clawed his way out with nothing but a voice, resisted. Running wasn't his way. Not tonight. Instead, he leaned closer to the officer, lowering his voice so that only the crickets could overhear. "How about this?" Elvis said, a spark of mischief dancing beneath the calm. "Why don't you climb into my car? Just for a drive. 10 minutes. No press, no headlines. Just you and me seeing where this road goes." The offer hung in the night like a dare, absurd and electrifying. The officer blinked, caught between duty and the impossible strangeness of it. He had backup coming, a man to detain, procedure to follow. Yet here was Elvis Presley, offering him something no handbook had ever prepared him for. His grip tightened on the flashlight, but his resolve wavered for the first time. The siren had begun this story, but the next move would decide how far it would go, and neither man could yet see the end. The hum of the patrol car's radio filled the night, an impatient pulse against the silence that had settled between the two men. The dispatcher's clipped words bled through the static, announcing that a second unit was already en route. It was only a matter of minutes before headlights cut across the horizon and transformed this surreal standoff into a full-blown scene, complete with paperwork, supervisors, and an audience. Elvis glanced at the glow of the dashboard clock inside his Black Hawk. Time was slipping away, and with it, the fragile privacy of this strange encounter. His gaze returned to the young officer who stood rigid in the shadows of the flashing lights, torn between the authority of his badge and the weight of the legend before him. "You know what's about to happen," Elvis said quietly, his drawl steady. "Another cruiser pulls up, and this turns into a circus. You'll do your job, maybe even put me in the back seat of that car. And tomorrow, the whole country will be talking about how one patrolman hauled Elvis Presley into a jail cell." The officer's lips pressed thin, but he didn't answer. His eyes betrayed the conflict raging inside. Elvis took a step closer, lowering his voice so it carried no further than the young man's ears. "Or," he continued, "you get in my car. Just you and me. No headlines, no sirens. A short ride. 10 minutes, maybe 20. You'll see what you need to see, and when we're done, you can decide what happens next." The proposition landed heavy. The officer's pulse hammered. Training had drilled into him that suspects weren't to dictate the terms. But this wasn't a drunk on Beale Street or a reckless teenager in a borrowed Chevy. This was a man whose voice had been the soundtrack of an era, whose face had stared back from posters pinned to bedroom walls across the nation. The badge demanded resistance. Humanity whispered curiosity. For several seconds, the young man said nothing. His flashlight beam trembled just slightly against the gravel. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he snapped it off, hooked it back onto his belt, and gave a single nod. 5 minutes, he muttered. Elvis's mouth curved into a half-smile, but there was no triumph in it. Only a quiet satisfaction, like a chess player moving a piece into place. He opened the passenger door of the Black Hawk with a sweep of his hand. "After you, officer." Inside the car, the world changed. The sirens dimmed behind tinted glass. The night shrank into a cocoon of leather upholstery and faint cologne. Elvis started the engine, the V8 purring like a beast kept on a leash, and steered back onto the empty stretch of road. For the first mile, neither spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of tires and the faint rattle of loose change in the cup holder. The officer sat stiff, hand resting on his holster out of habit, eyes flicking between the speedometer and the man behind the wheel. Finally, Elvis broke the silence. You know, people think this life is gold-plated. Mansions, cars, crowds screaming your name. And sure, it shines on the outside. But let me tell you, when the noise dies down and you're left alone with yourself, it's quiet in a way that could drown a man. The officer kept his gaze ahead, but the words sank in. He hadn't expected candor. He had expected excuses, bargaining, maybe arrogance. But not this. Elvis continued, voice low but charged with something raw. You spend years chasing a dream, and when you catch it, you realize it's heavier than you imagined. Every night on stage, I'm not just singing. I'm holding up an idea, a piece of hope, for everyone who believes in me. And sometimes, it's a weight that nearly breaks your spine. The officer's grip on his holster loosened. For the first time, he saw not a superstar, not a defiant celebrity, but a man carrying a burden invisible to most. The car slowed as Elvis guided it off the highway, turning onto a side road lit only by a flickering neon sign in the distance. A small diner came into view, one of those places where truckers stopped for burnt coffee and pie at ungodly hours. The lot was nearly empty. Elvis parked, killed the engine, and turned to the officer. You hungry? Or at least thirsty? Come on, let's sit down. Talk like men, not like suspect and cop. The officer blinked, caught off guard again. You're seriously inviting me to a coffee at a diner? In the middle of this? Elvis grinned faintly. Why not? Better than waiting for your backup to show up and drag both of us through a scene neither of us wants. There was a pause, then the officer sighed and pushed the door open. Gravel crunched underfoot as the two men crossed the lot and stepped into the faint glow of neon. The bell above the diner's door jingled softly, announcing their unlikely entrance. The interior smelled of stale tobacco and overbrewed coffee. A jukebox sat silent in the corner, its glass dusty, its selections outdated. A waitress behind the counter glanced up, her expression tired, until recognition hit like a bolt of lightning. Her eyes widened, her hand froze mid-motion with a coffee pot, and her lips parted in disbelief. Elvis lifted a finger to his lips, a subtle plea for discretion. To her credit, she nodded, though her hands trembled as she set two mugs on a table near the window. The officer slid into the booth opposite Elvis, still tense, but strangely drawn in by the absurdity of it all. This was not in any training manual. Elvis leaned back, stretching his shoulders as though shedding a weight. You wanted to do your job tonight. I respect that. More than you realize. But maybe there's more to this story than a ticket or an arrest. Maybe there's a lesson for both of us. The officer studied him, unsure whether he was being charmed or challenged. But in the dim light of the diner, watching a global icon pour sugar into a chipped mug, he felt the grip of protocol slipping. Somewhere outside, the faint rumble of an approaching engine stirred the air. Backup wasn't far off. Time was narrowing again. But for the moment, it was just the two of them. A lawman bound by duty, and a legend searching for a scrap of ordinary humanity, sharing coffee under the hum of a neon sign. And the story was only beginning. The diner's door closed with a tired jingle, sealing them into a world of cracked linoleum floors, humming fluorescent lights, and the faint hiss of grease still lingering from the evening rush. Outside, the neon sign sputtered with half-dead bulbs, casting the window in uneven flashes of red and blue that mixed eerily with the patrol car's lights still spinning faintly in the lot. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with lines carved by sleepless nights and too much smoke, couldn't keep her eyes from darting toward the booth where Elvis Presley now sat. She had poured coffee for truckers, drifters, and lonely husbands for 20 years, but nothing had prepared her for this. The man whose voice had been crooning from her kitchen radio since she was a girl was sitting 10 feet away, pouring cream into his cup with the casual air of someone who belonged in a place like this. The young officer slid opposite him, the vinyl seat groaning under his stiff posture. He hadn't unclenched since stepping inside, and the badge on his chest seemed to weigh twice as much now. His duty hadn't vanished with the neon glow. It hovered over him like a shadow. Arresting Elvis Presley still hung in the balance. Elvis lifted his cup and inhaled the bitter steam before speaking. "You ever notice," he began softly, "how a place like this feels the same no matter where you are? Memphis, Nashville, some highway town in the middle of nowhere. It's always burnt coffee, cheap sugar, tired faces, makes you forget who you are for a little while." The officer didn't reply at first. He stared into his own cup, the black surface trembling from the faint vibration of the jukebox in the corner. Finally, he muttered, "I don't forget who I am. Not in places like this. If anything, it reminds me." Elvis tilted his head, intrigued. "And who are you, son?" "I'm an officer of the law," he said firmly, though his voice betrayed the fatigue of someone reciting a line too many times. "And right now, my job is to treat you like anyone else who broke the rules." Instead of bristling, Elvis smiled faintly, almost approvingly. "Good. You should hold on to that. Most men lose it the moment temptation comes knocking." The waitress set down a plate of pie they hadn't ordered, her hands shaking so badly that the fork clinked against the porcelain. Elvis touched her wrist gently and whispered, "Thank you, darling. Don't you worry. Tonight, I'm just another customer." Her eyes misted, and she hurried back behind the counter, pressing a hand to her chest, as though to keep her heart from leaping out. The officer followed the exchange, conflicted. He was watching a man who seemed both impossibly larger than life and startlingly ordinary. The contradiction gnawed at him. "You make it sound easy," he said finally, "as if you can just step in here and turn yourself into a regular man for a night. But you can't." "Not really." Elvis leaned forward, lowering his voice so only the officer could hear. "That's the thing you don't see. I've been trying my whole life to be a regular man. Fame's a cage, son. The bars are made of flashbulbs and dollar bills. But it's still a cage. And some nights, I'd give anything to sit in a place like this and be invisible." Before the officer could respond, the bell over the door jingled again. 2 men walked in, truckers by the look of them, heavy boots, grease-stained jackets, eyes foggy from hours on the road. They spotted the booth immediately. One nudged the other, whispering with a grin, "Look at that. Some guy done up like Presley, sittin' with a cop. Guess they finally booked the king himself." The other laughed loud enough for the room to hear. "Maybe it's one of those impersonators. Can't be the real deal. He'd never be caught dead in here." The words hung, sharp as glass. The officer shifted uncomfortably, watching for Elvis's reaction. But Elvis didn't flare with anger. Instead, he pushed back from the booth, walked calmly to the jukebox, and slipped a coin into the slot. The machine whirred to life, spitting static before settling on a familiar tune. An old Presley ballad recorded years ago, his younger voice echoing faintly through the diner. He turned toward the truckers with a small, knowing smile and began to hum along, then sing, not loudly, not with the force of a stage performance, but in a low, velvety tone that filled the corners of the room like smoke curling through the air. The effect was immediate. The laughter died in the men's throats. The waitress froze mid-pour. Even the officer felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. There was no mistaking that voice, not in 1,000 years. When the song ended, Elvis returned to the booth, sliding back into his seat as though nothing had happened. The truckers muttered apologies under their breath and retreated to the far side of the diner, suddenly respectful. Elvis sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on the young man across from him. See? For a moment, I was just a singer again. No stage, no spotlight. Just a voice in the corner of a diner. That's all I ever wanted to be. The officer studied him with new eyes. He wasn't looking at an untouchable idol anymore. He was looking at a man who carried loneliness like a secret weight, who craved the simplicity that the rest of the world took for granted. And for the first time that night, the officer's certainty wavered, not about the law, but about what justice really looked like in this moment. Outside, the faint rumble of an approaching engine reminded them both that their time was running short. Backup was closing in. Choices would need to be made. But inside the diner, for just a little longer, the world had shrunk to two men at a booth, one guarding a duty, the other guarding his humanity, and the thin thread of understanding that bound them across the divide. The last tremor of Elvis's voice seemed to linger even after the jukebox spun itself back into silence. The truckers at the far end of the diner whispered in low tones now, no longer mocking. Their laughter dissolved into uneasy reverence. The waitress retreated to the counter, stealing glances as though she were watching history being written in the corner booth. The officer, however, couldn't let awe displace the knot of duty twisting in his chest. He leaned forward, hands clasped on the sticky tabletop, and forced the words out. That doesn't erase what happened. You broke the law tonight. If I let that slide because you can sing, then I'm nothing but a coward in uniform. Elvis didn't bristle. He stirred his coffee slowly, spoon clinking against the porcelain, eyes fixed on the swirl of cream dissolving in the dark liquid. And what good would it do, he asked softly, to drag me through the headlines tomorrow? You'll look dutiful. I'll look reckless, and folks will argue about it for a week before they forget. What lesson does that leave anyone with? The officer's voice sharpened. The lesson that no one is above the rules. Not even Elvis Presley. A silence fell between them, heavy but not hostile. Elvis finally set the spoon down, leaned back, and let the weight of his own memories surface. You think I've forgotten rules? I grew up knowing nothing but limits. One pair of shoes to last a year, rent my mama barely scraped together, the ache in her face when she thought I wasn't looking. I came from nothing, less than nothing. Every step I took out of Tupelo was a fight against rules that said a boy like me would never be more than a factory hand. The officer's mouth opened, but the words didn't come. He had heard the story before, in fragments, how Elvis rose from poverty to stardom, but never with this kind of rawness. I buried a brother I never knew, Elvis continued, voice tightening. Grew up with the ghost of him sitting in the room. You learn early what rules you can bend to survive, and which ones you can't. Tonight, maybe I bent the wrong one. I drove too fast. But don't think for a second I ever forgot what it means to answer for the things you do. The officer shifted, unsettled. His own memories crept forward. His father coughing after a double shift at the mill. His mother cutting coupons at the kitchen table. The way responsibility had landed on his shoulders before he even turned 20. Without meaning to, he found himself speaking aloud. My family's still scraping by. I work nights. I take extra shifts. Every dime I make keeps food on the table back home. You talk about coming from nothing. I'm still standing in it. The admission slipped out sharper than intended, but Elvis didn't take offense. He studied the young man with something close to kinship. "Then you understand what I mean. Success doesn't erase where you started. It only makes the distance harder to live with. You see me sitting in mansions, flying in jets. But what I see when I close my eyes is that shack in Tupelo, my mama stitching clothes by lamplight. I'm not a king. I'm just a man who can't shake the dirt he was born in." The officer's throat tightened. For the first time that night, he looked at Elvis not as a subject to control, but as a mirror of his own struggles, magnified by fame. Still, the badge on his chest burned against his conscience. "I hear you," he said quietly, "but that doesn't mean I can walk away from my duty. If I let you go, I'm spitting on the uniform I swore to honor." Elvis's eyes glimmered in the dim light, not with anger, but with an almost mischievous spark. "Then do it," he said suddenly. The officer blinked. "Do what?" "Take me in," Elvis replied calmly. "You said the law's the law. Then let's do it proper. You drive me to your station, book me like anyone else. No favors, no excuses, but—" He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I get one condition." The officer felt his chest tighten again. "What condition?" Elvis's lips curved into a half-smile. "You'll know when we get there." The vagueness was deliberate, the suspense hanging in the air like smoke. The officer tried to press him, but Elvis only sipped his coffee and leaned back, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the window. The truckers had left. The waitress retreated deeper into her duties, though her ears strained for every word. Outside, the sound of tires crunching gravel announced that another patrol car had arrived in the lot. The officer realized the moment of indecision was gone. His path was set. He slid out of the booth, dropped a few bills on the table despite Elvis's attempt to stop him, and straightened his uniform. "If you're serious," he said, voice hard again, "then we're going to the station." No turning back, Elvis rose too, towering slightly over him, calm as ever. "Then let's go see what kind of lesson tonight wants to teach." The bell above the door jingled again as they stepped into the cool air. The flashing lights of the backup unit swept across the lot, but Elvis seemed almost relieved. He moved toward the patrol car, not like a criminal, but like a man walking into an inevitable chapter of his own story. And the officer, torn between dread and strange anticipation, braced himself for whatever condition Elvis Presley would demand once they reached the station. The patrol car's tires whispered against the pavement as it rolled into the dim lot of a small-town precinct. The building itself looked more like a post office than a fortress of law. 2 stories of tired brick, windows glowing faintly under the buzz of fluorescent lights. It was past 2 in the morning, but inside, the place hadn't surrendered to sleep. A thin stream of smoke curled out the side door, where an officer on break stubbed his cigarette in disbelief at the sight pulling up before him. When the headlights swept across the front wall, Elvis turned his head slightly toward the young officer driving. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured. "A man who's sung before presidents is about to walk through the same doors as drunks and pickpockets." His tone wasn't mocking. There was almost relief in it, as though the absurdity itself freed him from expectation. The officer didn't reply. His grip on the wheel was tight, his jaw locked. He was too busy rehearsing the procedure in his mind. Log the arrest, call the sergeant, fill out the forms. Yet even as he told himself he was simply following protocol, his pulse betrayed him. He was about to escort Elvis Presley, into a holding room. No academy course had ever prepared him for that. When they stepped inside, conversation froze. A pair of desk clerks, half asleep over paperwork, jolted upright. A sergeant at the far end of the room removed his glasses in disbelief. For a long moment, the station felt like a theater where the curtain had risen on a scene nobody rehearsed. Elvis walked with unhurried dignity, pausing as though to acknowledge their stares. Then he turned toward the young officer and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Where do you want me? On the bench? In a cell? Or right here in the lobby?" The sergeant found his voice first. "What the hell is going on?" He rounded on the young patrolman. "Is this some kind of joke?" The officer stood straighter. "No, sir. Traffic violation. Excessive speed. I was following procedure." The sergeant's face hardened, but before he could issue an order, Elvis raised a hand. "He's telling the truth. I was driving too fast. And this man," he gestured toward the patrolman, "is doing exactly what he should." A ripple of disbelief moved through the room. Elvis Presley had admitted guilt in front of half the night shift. Some officers looked stunned, others suspicious. A few whispered among themselves, already imagining tomorrow's headlines. Elvis turned to the patrolman again, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "Remember what I told you. I'll accept whatever penalty comes, but only if it's the same as anyone else. No special favors, no red carpet treatment. That's my condition." The officer blinked. "That's it? That's your condition?" "That's it," Elvis confirmed, his gaze steady. "No man should stand above the rules, not even me. If you're going to process me, then process me like you would any other driver you picked up tonight." The words rippled through the station like a shock wave. Several officers exchanged glances, half admiration, half panic. Some worried about the scandal, others about the paperwork. But none could ignore the gravity of what was happening. The sergeant tried to intervene, muttering about discretion and how these things can be handled quietly. But Elvis turned on him with unexpected firmness. "No, if you silence him tonight," he said, pointing to the young patrolman, "then you teach every man in this room that the badge is for sale. And I won't be a part of that." The station fell silent. The sergeant's mouth tightened, but he had no answer. So Elvis sat, yes, sat, on the hard wooden bench usually reserved for drunks sobering up. His rings gleamed under the sterile light, but his posture was relaxed, almost peaceful. The clerks at the desk didn't know whether to laugh or call the press. One finally reached for the phone to alert the city editor of the Memphis Press Scimitar. But Elvis beat him to it. Calmly, he asked for the desk phone, dialed a number from memory, and when the reporter answered groggily, Elvis said, "Get down to the station. You'll want to see this with your own eyes." Then he hung up, leaving the room buzzing with disbelief. The officer could hardly breathe. "You just invited the press?" he whispered, horrified. Elvis met his gaze with quiet conviction. "If I'm going to sit here, I want the world to know the law doesn't bend for me. That's the only story worth telling." The hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder in the silence that followed. Somewhere in the back, a typewriter began its steady tapping, as if the night itself were already recording the chapter into history. And for the first time since the siren first split the highway, the young officer understood. This night wasn't going to fade away with a citation. It was going to carve itself into legend, not because Elvis was a star, but because Elvis insisted on being treated as anything but. The station clock ticked toward 3 in the morning when the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the lobby. The door swung open, letting in a gust of night air and a man with a notepad tucked under one arm. His shirt was wrinkled, tie askew, eyes still heavy from sleep, but already sharp with the glint of a story worth chasing. It was Frank Dillard, a reporter who had been covering Memphis crime and politics for 2 decades. He had interviewed governors, written obituaries, and sifted through countless arrests that blurred into one another. But when he looked across the lobby and saw Elvis Presley sitting calmly on the hard wooden bench reserved for drunks and vagrants, his jaw nearly dropped. "Elvis," he muttered, almost forgetting himself. Then louder to the room, "What on earth is going on here?" No one answered at first. The sergeant busied himself with a pile of forms, refusing to meet the reporter's eye. The desk clerks shifted uncomfortably. Finally, it was Elvis himself who broke the silence. "I was driving too fast," he said evenly. "This officer here," he motioned toward the young patrolman, "did his job. I'm here because I broke the rules. That's all you need to know." Dillard's pencil hovered above his pad. "And you want this printed?" "That's why I called you," Elvis replied, his tone calm, but carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "The people who buy your paper need to see that the law is stronger than any man's name. Even mine." The officer's stomach twisted. He could already picture the headline, "Elvis Presley booked for speeding." Tomorrow, copies of the paper would be stacked at every corner store, devoured by readers across the South. His own name might not appear, but his actions would. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. Dillard scribbled furiously, but before he could finish, the sergeant finally snapped. "This is madness," he barked. "We don't need the press meddling in department business." Elvis turned to him, voice calm but firm. "You don't want the press here because you're afraid of embarrassment. But what this young man did tonight is nothing to be ashamed of. He stood his ground. He treated me like he would anyone else. That's something the public deserves to know." The sergeant's face burned red, torn between anger and the unshakable truth in Elvis's words. Dillard glanced between them, sensing the tension. "So, let me get this straight," he said. "You're telling me Elvis Presley, the most famous man in America, wants this story published? Wants people to see him booked like any ordinary citizen?" Elvis met his gaze directly. "That's exactly what I want." The reporter sat back, stunned. In all his years, he had never met a celebrity begging to be held accountable in the press. It was the opposite of how power worked in Memphis, or anywhere. And yet here was Presley, eyes steady, voice unwavering, insisting on it. At that moment, the young patrolman felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd been carrying, fear of ridicule, fear of scandal, lightened. Elvis wasn't just enduring the arrest, he was transforming it into a statement, one that might outlast both of them. Still, not everyone in the room was convinced. One of the older officers leaned close to the patrolman and muttered under his breath, "Son, do yourself a favor. Write this up as a warning. Tear the damn report in half and send him home before this explodes in your face." The young officer's throat tightened. The temptation was real. Shred the paperwork, let Presley walk, pretend the night never happened. He could go home with his badge intact, his career unthreatened. But before he could answer, Elvis spoke again, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't you dare," he said, eyes locked on the officer. "Don't you let anyone take away the choice you made on that road tonight. You stood up for what was right. Don't throw that away now." The words struck like a hammer. The officer straightened, his resolve hardening again. He turned to the sergeant and said, "The report stays. I'll file it." For a moment, silence gripped the room. Then Dillard's pencil scratched faster, recording every syllable. The sergeant fumed, but he could see the tide turning. Elvis Presley himself was backing the patrolman's decision, and the reporter was already framing it into history. Resistance was useless. When Elvis finally rose from the bench, the hush that fell over the room was almost reverent. He looked at the young officer and said quietly, "You'll be remembered for this more than you know. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." Dillard snapped his notebook shut, eyes gleaming with the headline already forming in his mind. He could almost see it inked across tomorrow's front page, "The King equal before the law." Outside, dawn was still hours away, but inside the station, it felt as if something irreversible had already broken through the night. By sunrise, the story had already broken free of the station's walls. Newspaper delivery boys pedaled through Memphis streets, tossing rolled copies onto porches where milk bottles still glistened with condensation. Headlines screamed in bold type, "Elvis Presley booked for speeding. The King says the law is for everyone." Some papers took a mocking tone, hinting at scandal. Others treated it with awe, hailing the act as rare humility from a man perched at the summit of fame. Either way, the image had been cast. Elvis Presley, seated on a police bench like any other offender, insisting on no special treatment. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered outside the precinct. Housewives still in curlers, teenagers clutching record sleeves, factory workers fresh off night shifts. An unlikely mix stood shoulder to shoulder, craning for a glimpse. Some waved hand-painted signs that read, "Free Elvis," though he was already free. Others simply clapped when patrol cars rolled by, unsure which one carried the man they'd come to see. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. The sergeant had fielded half a dozen phone calls from city officials furious about the coverage, demanding explanations. Clerks tried to continue with paperwork, but kept sneaking glances at the young officer whose name had begun to circulate alongside Elvis's. His chest tightened at the thought of what this meant. Career suicide or career definition, depending on how the wind blew. Then the lobby doors opened, and murmurs swelled into cheers. Elvis emerged, flanked not by guards, but by dignity alone. He had spent the night in an office chair rather than a cell, an arrangement born not of privilege, but of logistics. The jail crowded with drunks who might have turned the night into a circus. He looked tired, yes, but calm, dressed exactly as he had been the night before. The crowd pressed closer. Shouts erupted. "Say it isn't true, Elvis! Tell them you didn't do it! Elvis, we love you!" But Elvis raised a hand, not for applause, but for quiet. His voice carried firmly across the street. "I did break the speed limit." "That part is true," he said. "And I accepted the consequence, same as anyone else should. The law doesn't bend because you've sold a few records or stood on a stage. I was wrong, and I answered for it. That's the end of the story." A hush swept the crowd. This wasn't the charm-drenched performer they expected. This was a man speaking plainly, without showmanship. The weight of his honesty startled them into silence. He turned slightly, motioning toward the young officer standing a step behind him. "And let me tell you something else. This man here did what many wouldn't. He looked past the name, past the noise, and he did his duty. You cheer for me, but you ought to cheer for him too." The officer froze, his throat tightening as the crowd shifted its gaze toward him. A few clapped tentatively, then more joined in. Soon the applause swelled, not the wild roar of a concert, but steady, heartfelt recognition. His ears burned red, but inside, a strange pride steadied him. Reporters jotted furiously, cameras snapped, the shutters echoing like small explosions. Every word, every gesture was being immortalized. Yet Elvis remained unflinching, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "This isn't about shame," he continued. "It's about example. If I can't accept a mistake, how can I stand on a stage and tell others to believe in me? Remember this, nobody is too big to answer for what they do." The words hit with force. Some in the crowd bowed their heads, others wept openly. For the older generation, it was a reminder of principles they feared were vanishing. For the young, it was a lesson disguised as defiance. When Elvis finished, he didn't linger. He simply placed a hand on the young officer's shoulder, a gesture heavy with meaning, and walked slowly to his waiting car. The crowd parted for him, murmurs rippling like a tide, unsure whether to cheer or stay solemn. Inside the precinct, officers watched from the windows, astonished. Some had scoffed at the idea of Presley sitting in their lobby hours earlier. Now they saw the headlines shifting from ridicule to reverence, their station at the center of a national moment. The young patrolman remained on the steps, heart pounding. He had carried out a duty he once feared would ruin him. Instead, he found himself standing inside a story that would follow him for the rest of his days. As Elvis's car pulled away, a hush lingered in the street, broken only by the sound of newspapers rustling in the hands of those still reading the words that turned a speeding ticket into something larger, a lesson about law, equality, and dignity in the most unlikely of places. And though the day had only begun, everyone knew the legend of that night was already sealed. The frenzy outside the station faded as the morning turned to afternoon. By evening, the crowd had thinned, reporters had filed their stories, and the young officer returned to the rhythm of paperwork and calls. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. He had gone from faceless patrolman to reluctant figure in a story already spreading beyond Memphis. But while the city buzzed, Elvis remained curiously silent. He didn't issue statements through his manager, didn't call press conferences. He went home, slipping behind the gates of Graceland as if the night had been only a passing storm. 3 days later, a plain envelope arrived at the precinct. It bore no signature, only the name of a Memphis bank. Inside was a certified check, large enough to purchase new radios, upgraded vests, and training equipment the department had long needed but could never budget for. The memo line was blank. The donation was anonymous. The sergeant frowned, skeptical. The young officer, however, understood instantly. Elvis had kept his word. He wanted the law respected, not bent by his influence, yet he also wanted to leave something behind for the men who carried the badge. And he had done it without attaching his name, without asking for gratitude. Weeks later, confirmation came quietly from the bank, whispered through back channels. The benefactor had been Presley. By then, the department had already cashed the check. New radios arrived in crates, the battered equipment replaced. Most officers simply marveled at their good fortune, but the young patrolman felt a deeper weight in his chest. Elvis had honored him without ever saying so aloud. Yet the truest acknowledgement came not in money, but in something more intimate. One late night, as the patrolman finished his shift, he stopped at a familiar roadside diner, the same one where the surreal encounter had begun. He stepped inside, expecting only bitter coffee and silence. Instead, a familiar figure was already seated in the corner booth. Elvis looked up, half-smile tugging at his mouth. No entourage, no cameras, just him. He gestured for the officer to sit. The patrolman slid into the seat, the vinyl cool beneath him. For a moment, neither spoke. The jukebox hummed quietly in the background, a gospel record crackling through worn speakers. Finally, Elvis broke the silence. "You gave me something that night," he said. "You reminded me I'm not untouchable." "That's a gift, son. One I won't forget." The officer swallowed hard. "I was just doing my job." "Maybe so," Elvis said, eyes steady. "But plenty of men would have let the moment slip, just for the shine of my name." "You didn't. That's rare." The waitress brought 2 coffees without being asked. Elvis wrapped his hands around the mug as though grounding himself. The world will make its own story about that night. Some will laugh. Some will praise. But the truth is ours, between us, and truth matters more than headlines. The young man nodded, words caught in his throat. He realized then that the story wasn't about arresting a legend or surviving scandal. It was about two men from different worlds, finding common ground in honesty. When they finished their coffee, Elvis stood and laid a few bills on the table. He placed a hand briefly on the officer's shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply. No flourish, no spectacle. Then he left, the door's jingle marking his exit into the night. The patrolman sat for a long while, staring at the empty booth across from him. The sound of the highway filtered faintly through the glass, mingling with the distant strains of gospel from the jukebox. That night would never be fully written in the papers. The donation would remain anonymous, the diner conversation unreported. The legend that spread across the country told of Elvis Presley, humbled before the law. But the deeper truth, the quiet dignity of his final gesture, belonged only to those who had lived it. And as the patrolman finally rose, stepping back into the cool night air, he carried with him the certainty that greatness wasn't measured by fame or fortune. It was measured in the willingness to stand equal, even when the world insisted you were more. The road stretched dark and silent before him, the same as the night it had all begun. But now, every mile felt different, as though touched by the echo of a story that had slipped past spectacle and into something eternal.